Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome Professor Anand Menon to Brexit Watch. Professor Menon is the Director of the UK in a Changing Europe, as well as serving as Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. Professor Menon, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thanks for having me on, Jonathan. The way you said serving, you made it sound like a prison sentence or something.
Well, I hope it's not that. And obviously our focus today will be everything Brexit related. But before we get into the Brexit situation, the EU-UK transition negotiations, and I want to talk about that, obviously our lives have been dominated since March by the coronavirus crisis. We obviously have a pretty bad economic situation in this country. We're not alone, although by all accounts, the UK has done particularly badly on the economic front. Just looking at the raw statistics, the government's flagship furlough scheme is due to be unwound over the next few months. What has been your overall assessment of how the government has handled the crisis and what things look like in the near term for the UK?
Well, I think like governments around the world, our government has struggled. There have been obvious mistakes made. I mean, I think it looks now like lockdown was delayed unnecessarily. On the economic front, I think the Chancellor, certainly in March, handled things very decisively and well. The proof of the pudding is going to be how he manages our emergence from coronavirus. I don't place too much stock on the figures that show that we were doing worst out of the OECD economies, because a large part of that I think is down to timing, because it hit us later. The Q2 figures reflected many of our partner countries coming out of coronavirus while we were still in it. So I think Q3 figures are going to be far more revealing in that respect. But ultimately, the real challenges lie ahead. And here, we're just going to have to see whether or not the Chancellor is willing to keep going with levels of state support targeted at the particular requirements of a post-corona economy. So what I'm thinking there is whether or not, for instance, there will be money for extra public sector employment, perhaps in care and social care, which would be one way of stimulating employment, extra money for training and for those seeking jobs. So how you stimulate the jobs market and get people in jobs is going to be key to the next phase. And as yet, we're not entirely sure what the government plans to do.
And moving on to Brexit, the EU and the UK are currently in this transition situation. During this period, the UK are due to end at the end of 2020. The UK remains in the single market and the customs union. It's still paying into the bloc, although it no longer has representation in the European Parliament. This week is round 7 of the negotiations. I believe it's concluding today, led by David Frost on the UK side and by Michel Barnier on the EU side. What's been your overall assessment of how the negotiations have gone so far?
I suppose brutally, they haven't so far. And I fully expect that when the talks break up today, we'll have yet another of those sort of Groundhog Day moments where Michel Barnier and David Frost come out and say, there are serious problems we have to overcome before we can get an agreement. On the Brussels side, there's a degree of frustration. I mean, there are some on the EU side who say that Britain just isn't negotiating, but the specific frustrations are around things like state aids, because what the EU says is we can't come to an agreement without an agreement on state aids. We can't come to an agreement on state aids unless the UK tells us what its plans are, and they haven't. So my sense has always been that actually, insofar as there is a chance of progress, and there is a chance of progress, it'll happen in September or conceivably even only October, when the political heavyweights on both sides of the channel get involved and authorise the sorts of concessions from both sides that we're going to need to get to a deal.
Do you think, Anand, as we head towards the end of the year, that will start to focus minds?
Probably. I mean, I say probably because, of course, in the event that we end up with a second wave or a second spike of the coronavirus, then that will monopolise political attention. So there's a danger, you know, even if you think like I do, that actually with a bit of political will, we can get this over the line and get a Brexit deal. There is a danger that if something comes along and distracts people, that will get in the way of our ability to sign a deal. But yeah, I think all things being equal, politicians will start to think on both sides of the channel. Remember, Boris Johnson has been obsessed with the pandemic, quite rightly so. On the other side of the water, our partners, for them, Brexit has become a fourth, fifth, sixth order issue because of squabbles over the budget, because of COVID. But what we need is for them to spend a bit of time thinking about Brexit. And all things being equal, I think by the end of September, early October, they're going to have to do that. And then things will move quite fast.
And you mentioned there about the perspective in Brussels. I'd like to go back to the, in a moment, go back to the transition negotiations, but sticking with the EU for a moment. From my perspective, the EU hasn't at times covered itself in glory over the last few months. We've had the Corona bonds debacle. We've also had medical exports being banned at times. An 11th hour deal was devised over the new EU budget and rescue fund. One gets the impression Germany sort of came round a little bit. They feared what the alternative might look like. We've had the Frugal Four, we've had their rebates. What's been your overall assessment on the EU side of how they have dealt so far with the coronavirus crisis and what we're likely to see in the EU from here on in?
Well, how they've dealt with it varies because, of course, public health and health in general are national competences. So each country has approached it differently, and you can see big differences with the way, say, Germany has dealt with the virus as compared to, say, Italy or Spain. On the broader issue of the budget and the discussions over the recovery fund, the EU has done what it always does. That's to say, it's muddled through. It's managed to put together a compromise that just about pleases everyone. The danger of the compromise, I think, is it probably also irritates people, the populists and anti-EU forces across the European Union. And given that I think that's the fundamental problem the EU faces, it's not Brussels that's the problem, it's national politics that's the problem in the European Union at the moment. I wonder whether actually what has been agreed will provide ammunition for populist forces, not only in the Frugal Four, who will be saying, what are we doing paying for countries in the south, but in the south as well, where, of course, a lot of rhetoric in places like Italy stress the fact that there should be grants given to the southern countries rather than loans, because this was a common problem that everyone faced. So the full political implications of what has been agreed won't be visible yet, but I wonder whether actually populists will be able to make hay on the back of it.
Do you think also federalists may as well? I mean, do you think this goes far enough for some of the ardent federalists in the EU?
I think increasingly federalism is a bit of a niche sport in EU politics. You get the noisy ones like Guy Verhofstadt, who are always out there sort of talking about it. I think you will struggle to find in the member states people who talk in terms of federalism. They talk in terms of other ambitions, such as strategic autonomy. But I think everyone in the European Union realises that what you have to have is a balance between EU and national competence. And I don't think there's a single member state there that is saying, let us give loads more power to Brussels and take it away from national capitals.
You mentioned Southern Europe. I'm quite interested in Central and Eastern Europe too. I mean, they've been a little bit aggrieved recently with this rescue deal, and not least because they thought they might get the rough end of the deal. And also because it's being suggested that disbursement of funds may be tied to adherence to what Brussels would call European values. How do you see that playing out?
I think it is very, very hard, and it has always been hard for the European Union to discipline one of its member states. One of the things about European Union is it's far more demanding to pass the test for joining than it is to pass the test of being a member. That's because once you're a member, you're around the table, you have a vote, you have allies. Yes, there is some pressure to impose rule of law conditions on the disbursement of EU funds. I suspect that any such conditions will not be particularly binding, and that the Central and East European countries will actually not find the full, not be subject to those kinds of constraints in any meaningful way. Where things get interesting, I think, there are two sort of substantive issues that matter for those countries. The first is immigration. And the EU is going to have to tackle again this question of how you do burden sharing when it comes to migration from the south, which is a growing problem at the moment. And secondly, about the environmental ambitions of this European Commission, because of course the countries in Eastern Europe are saying, hang on, this will cost us disproportionately more than everyone else because we're starting from a lower base. So there are big substantive issues where I think some of those Central and East European countries are going to get in the way of smooth EU decision making.
Do you think there's a risk of disintegration?
No, because I think no member state, even countries like Hungary, and Hungary is a real issue for the European Union at the moment because of Prime Minister Orban. Hungary has no intention of leaving the European Union because the European Union sends regular checks. But Hungary equally has no intention to let the European Union tell it how to run its own show. So I think countries want to stay in, they want the benefits of membership, but without the constraints. And so that's the tension you'll see is, you might see decision-making slowing down as troublesome governments in some member states get in the way and say, actually, we're not doing that. But I don't think there's a desire anywhere in the bloc for people to leave.
I wonder what may happen if some of the money starts to dry up, though.
Well, that is a big question. And of course, you've got to wonder, that works in two ways, I suppose. One, if in future EU budgets, poorer countries don't get the settlement they think they deserve, I still think for poorer member states, the attractions of membership are huge. But the other question, of course, is whether the shock of coronavirus is going to have serious implications for economies that were already weak, like the Italian economy. Because remember, if you have a serious economic crisis in Italy, the Italian economy is far too big for the EU to bail out the way it bailed out the Greek economy. And that could be problematic for them. But at the moment, things look relatively okay on that front.
You mentioned Italy. Do you think there is a threat of sovereign debt crises in the EU and the Eurozone?
I think there is a potential for it. I don't think the potential is particularly great at the moment. I mean, the data is quite unreliable. It strikes me that quite a lot of work has been done to shore up a very, very wobbly banking sector. I remember a couple of years ago, everyone was worried about the Italian banking sector. But, you know, we'll have to see how this crisis plays out. If this crisis is long and deep, then it is going to cause real economic problems, particularly in those weaker economies.
And let's leave the EU and the Eurozone for a moment and return back to the transition negotiations. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned state aid rules. These are some of the issues that keep coming up: state aid, the so-called level playing field, fishing. How can the two sides reach an accord on some of these most contentious of issues?
Well, let's take fishing first. You do it by sort of splitting the difference, I suppose. That is to say, what the EU started off saying is we want exactly the same access to UK waters as we had when you were a member of the Common Fisheries Policy. To which the UK government said, oi, hang on a sec, we've left. So we don't grant you automatic access to our waters anymore. The UK also insists on the right of renegotiating whatever deal is struck regularly, whereas the EU wants a long-term deal. So I suppose you split the difference. You end up with a deal whereby the EU continues to have access to UK waters, but less access than it has had before. So the UK government can turn around to British fishermen and say, see, we've got you some extra fish. At the same time, there's a deal struck whereby Parliament ultimately has to approve whatever is agreed and has to do so regularly. But actually, the British government, through nods and winks, makes it clear to the European Union that whilst formally we've taken back control, ultimately we understand that we need to keep giving them access, not least so we can sell our seafood products in the European Union. And in that kind of way, I think both sides can just about walk away happy that the European fishermen are catching slightly fewer fish in our waters, British fishermen are catching slightly more, and Britain has reassumed control and gets the ultimate say over who accesses our waters.
Whether or not, Anand, there is a deal likely sort of around autumn time, and obviously that's the time when the furlough scheme will be unwound. We may have a lot of economic hardship coming our way at that time. I actually saw the other day that Germany is extending its furlough scheme to 2 years, actually, just coincidentally. Do you think it is possible, despite what Downing Street have said, that there may be a fudge, that an extension may be fudged at the 11th hour?
I think that's incredibly unlikely. Again, I mean, the devil lies in the detail. What you mean by an extension? Transition as it is now, I don't think can be extended because legally, I don't really see a way in which that can be done. It might be that we end up with, you know, Brexit is a story of repackaging old phrases all the time. we get some kind of implementation phase. So they agree a framework agreement and they say, while we're putting this into effect and actually negotiating a few other things that we haven't quite got round to, then we will allow trade to continue more or less as it is now. But again, legally on the EU side, it is very, very difficult to see how they allow the UK to continue to be in the single market and the customs union without all member states signing that off, i.e. without it being a deal in its own right. So there will be a change in our trading conditions that is fairly significant come the end of this year, I think.
What may be some of the implications, the electoral implications, or the implications for the Conservative Party if there was such an implementation period? Do you think some of their core supporters, their Brexit supporting supporters, would feel betrayed in any way, or do you think they would accept such an implementation period?
I suppose the devil again lies in the detail. It's a question of how this is sold. If Boris Johnson comes back with some kind of free trade agreement and says there's a bit more stuff we want to negotiate, so we're going to keep some sort of status quo going, it won't look like transition, I don't think. So in that sense, he will have fulfilled his pledge to end transition and take us out of the single market and the customs union. My sense at the moment is he probably has the political authority to get away with something that slightly fudges the situation if the EU will allow him to do so. But there will always be those on his own benches who complain, which is why I really don't think there is any danger under this government of us seeing what we used to call a Brexit in name only. I think when we get to the end of the year, there will be a pretty clear shift from the status quo transition.
And for a lot of, for a lot of Brexiteers, there is increasing concern about the configuration of the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Irish Protocol. There's been some noise made recently on the Tory backbenches over this issue, a real fear that actually Northern Ireland could essentially be left behind in the EU customs union. What are your thoughts about that? Is it even remotely conceivable that that could be repudiated? Would there be the will to repudiate it? What would be the implications be of repudiation?
I have to say, I have relatively little sympathy for parliamentarians who sign something and then a year later say, hang on a sec, I didn't read it properly. This was pushed through Parliament with their support last autumn. It says exactly what it said then. It is now an international agreement that has been lodged with the United Nations, that has been ratified by both sides. If we are genuinely planning to relaunch ourselves as global Britain, seeking to sign trade deals around the world, I think actually repudiating the first agreement we signed post-membership of the European Union would not be a very, very good look at all. So I don't take seriously this issue of getting rid of the withdrawal agreement. My sense is rather that the people who are talking in that way, notably Ian Duncan Smith, part of what they're doing is doing it to hold the Prime Minister's feet to the fire when it comes to the negotiations going on now. It is to say, look, we're so Brexity, we don't even like the withdrawal agreement, so don't you try messing with us when it comes to the future relationship, because we really will kick up a fuss. That's how I'm reading it at the moment. I don't think there is serious support either within or without Parliament for repudiating the withdrawal agreement.
What would be the implications for Northern Ireland if the withdrawal agreement went ahead as it is?
Well, the implications for Northern Ireland are partly tied to the trade deal. So if you imagine, it won't happen, it's purely hypothetical. If you imagine that Boris Johnson signed a trade deal that effectively meant the UK stayed in the customs union and the single market, the implications for Northern Ireland would be that there are absolutely no checks between GB and NI in either direction. Now, we know that's not the sort of deal Boris Johnson wants. He's going to sign a far thinner trade deal. When it's thinner, it implies the need for checks on goods going from GB to NI. And the thinner the deal, the more intrusive those checks. And that's one of the big differences between deal and no deal. If we end up without a trade deal, the checks on goods going into Northern Ireland are going to have to be quite frequent and quite intrusive. If we end up with a deal with the EU that, say, scraps tariffs and quotas for goods, far fewer checks are needed. But it does change the terms of trade between GB and NI.
So, Anand, you could almost say that without wishing to put words in your mouth, you could almost say that the closer a relationship the UK has with the EU going forward, the more concealed the issue with Northern Ireland will be, and the easier any economic transactions will be between GB and NI.
Yeah, and you could turn that on its head. You could say the harder the Brexit, the harder the border, which is definitely the case. The more we diverge from the European Union, the more checks are required on things going into Northern Ireland, because those things are effectively entering the European market.
Do you believe that the Prime Minister can fulfil all his other Brexit obligations if the withdrawal agreement and NI protocol go ahead as they are currently constituted?
That's a good question. To a point. I mean, bear in mind that in the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is a stipulation that EU state aid rules, precisely the rules that the government is utterly rejecting during the Brexit negotiations, that those rules will continue to apply to Northern Ireland. Okay? And if you end up with, so if, for instance, you end up with UK-wide tax measures to help businesses, which help businesses in the GB and NI, they will come under the purview of EU state aid rules because they apply for Northern Ireland. So actually, we are already bound by EU state aid rules to a significant extent under the terms of what we have already signed up to. So in that sense, then no, we cannot be entirely free of EU state aid rules because we've signed up to something that binds us to them. Equally, it is simply not the case that there will not be checks on goods going from GB to Northern Ireland, which is what the Prime Minister said during the election campaign, if you remember, because the nature of the deal that looks likely to be signed means that those checks are going to be inevitable.
Anand, you've mentioned trade deals around the world, or the trade deals the UK is currently negotiating. So I'd like to touch on that as well. Mm-hmm. Right now, the UK is in trade negotiations, as I understand it, with the United States, also with Australia, with New Zealand, and with Japan. Apparently, the Japanese one is having a bit of a stumbling block over, I think it's Stilton, isn't it?
Blue cheese.
Yeah. How important are these trade deals for the UK, and what is your sense of how they are going at the moment?
I think these talks are very important politically for the government. That is to say, post-Brexit, with a government that has been elected on the back of essentially a coalition of Leave voters. I mean, I think 82% of Tory voters were Leave supporters. It is very important to be able to hold up trade treaties and say, see, global Britain, these are the trade deals we couldn't do as part of the European Union, but we can do now as global Britain. So I think in symbolic political terms, it is crucial. In economic terms, it is relatively unimportant. Because as yet, this might change, though I'm sceptical, our trade with all these countries is only a tiny fraction in terms of the scale of our trade with the European Union, the reason being geography. So the LSE did a study about 2 or 3 years ago, I remember, in which they estimated that if we signed a trade deal with the United States that scrapped every single tariff both ways on trade with the United States, the net benefit to our economy would be in the order of 0.3% of GDP. Which in terms of the impact of Brexit forecast for the UK economy is pretty small beer.
You mentioned geography, Anand. I mean, obviously this coronavirus crisis has really upended global supply chains. The economic contractions that we have seen, I was doing some research the other day, they're just phenomenal. We've never seen anything like this. And then there may be a desire to reshore and onshore critical industry in the coming years. Look at the PPE shortages we've seen in several countries, including Britain. Do you think this will have implications for trade going forward, and perhaps might change the nature of international trade? So geography perhaps is mattering less and less, particularly in the area of services. Do you think this may be this may change the nature of trade going forward and maybe more advantageous for the UK as it charts a course away from the EU?
I wouldn't necessarily agree that geography is mattering less and less to any significant degree, to be honest. There are still very, very strong geographical patterns to international trade. The answer on COVID, quite simply, is I don't know. I don't know the degree to which we revert to a world before March. The future looks very different if there is a reliable vaccine that is widely available to if there isn't a vaccine that is widely available. We will see some reshoring. I think what we'll see is in areas like PPE, in areas like pharmaceuticals, I think states will make an effort to become more self-reliant. if we live under the threat of COVID for the foreseeable future, international trade volumes will continue to be significantly lower than they were beforehand. But that all depends on what happens with the virus itself. I personally think if we end up with a vaccine that is reliable, then the world of tomorrow will look more like the world of yesterday than many people assume. And that international trade will start to grow again. Because trade, of course, helps with the prosperity of each country, and we are dependent on goods that are made all over the world at the moment. So I don't see the taps being turned off as long as we end up with a way of dealing with the virus successfully. But at the moment, you're absolutely right. International trading volumes have decreased. And that, in a sense, is a problem for post-Brexit Britain, because if we're trading far less with countries far away, it is even harder to make up for a loss of trade with the European Union by trade deals with countries like China. I mean, leave aside the political problems with China, United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and so on. I mean, there are far fewer flights in the air these days than there were pre-COVID. And remember, much freight goes in passenger aircraft.
Although shipping, of course, has never been cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Switching back to the EU for a moment, Anand, we were speaking earlier about how they may well muddle through implications to Central and Eastern Europe and for the Mediterranean countries as well. What do you think the EU and Eurozone will look like 5 years from now?
Good. My rather boring answer is probably very similar to how they look now. I do not expect any massive jumps forward in European integration. All this talk that, you know, with Britain gone, we can steer a course towards a more united Europe, forgets the fact that many member states are there to wield their own vetoes in those events. There's a degree of Euroscepticism around. I think pretty similar to how it is now, but yet more fractious, because I think when we get things like the Italian elections in a couple of years, what we're going to see is populist anti-EU forces doing rather well across the bloc. So I think it's going to become progressively harder to move things in the European Union. And yet, as I said before, I still don't think, even if you look at populist forces like the French Front National, any appetite there might have been in the past for leaving the euro or leaving the European Union seems to have totally dissipated. They seem to have taken that sort of demand out of their programs now. So the danger the EU faces, I don't think, is fragmentation, but stasis. That you end up in a situation where the demands of the various national capitals are irreconcilable. So it becomes extremely difficult to take decisions.
And if things are static, is that problematic? I mean, I've heard it said of the EU that it's a bit like the EU is a bit like riding a bicycle. It's stable so long as it's moving, certainly as long as it's moving forward. So if it becomes static, do you think that in itself could represent an existential threat for the bloc?
Yeah, I think that was Jacques Delors who came up with that bicycle theory of European integration. And yeah, it is problematic, I think. And it's problematic not because of European integration per se, it's problematic because the world keeps changing and public policy needs to keep pace with those changes in the world. And if you're struggling to make decisions in a timely fashion, it's far harder to keep pace. Now, the European Union sees itself as an innovator when it comes to regulation, when it comes to environmentalism, but that depends on its ability to take decisions, and many of those key decisions are going to depend on a consensus among member states that I suspect is going to become harder and harder to achieve over time.
Without wishing to sound too conspiratorial, taking all of that into account, do you think that the EU has a vested interest in Brexit being tough, looking tough for the UK? Lest other member states may look to follow Britain out the door?
Well, let me take both those parts sequentially. Yes, I don't think there is any illusion in the European Union that leaving the European Union should look worse than being in the European Union. I think it's dawned on everyone in the EU that actually the UK outside has to be shown to be in trouble economically because of leaving. Otherwise, people will ask the question, what's the point of this? However, I've always thought that the threat of others leaving has always been exaggerated. If you look at the member states if you look at the 27, there are several things about them. One, the majority of member states are small countries, and small countries do not leave large blocs because they see large blocs as a security blanket. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the majority of member states of the EU are members of the euro. And if you thought Brexit was difficult and messy, imagine doing Brexit and changing your currency at the same time. It would be a nightmare, incredibly, which isn't a pro-EU argument. It's just an argument to say it's very, very hard to leave, however hacked off with the club you might be. And the final, I think, most important thing about it is we were always a bit of an outlier in terms of the degree to which we felt European, in the degree to which we felt like this was a project we were part of. We had a European identity. We were always an outlier. I think in all the other member states, political attachment to the EU project has been and remains far stronger than it ever was in this country. I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the French president, when he gives a press conference or an interview or anything, he has two flags behind him. French flag and the EU flag. Imagine that in a UK context. Well, you can't, can you? It's just unimaginable. So Europe is in the political DNA of the 27 in a way it never was here. And actually, the final thing I'll say, sorry, this is a very long and sort of going on answer. Part of the reason is for all the 27, European integration is an economic project with an explicitly political purpose. So for the original 6, it was an economic project designed to prevent further wars. For the southern countries that joined in the sort of early 1980s, European integration was a way of entrenching democracy after a period of dictatorship. For the countries of Eastern Europe, European integration is a project that ties them back into what they call their European home and makes sure that those sort of democratic anti-communist values are embedded. The difference with us was we always saw European integration as an economic project for explicitly economic objectives. And we never had that sort of political glue that holds the other member states in, I think.
But of course, the Central and Eastern European countries mostly aren't in the Eurozone, so perhaps it would be slightly easier for them at one level compared to the likes of Italy, Spain, Portugal and Greece to leave if they chose in the future.
In that sense, definitely, yes, but the Central and Eastern European countries realise that the checks from Brussels are pretty useful, are economically trying to catch up with the other countries of the European Union, and the single market and the customs union are seen as ways of helping them to do that.
And we've spoken about a lot today. We touched on the coronavirus situation. We've spoken about the transition negotiations, withdrawal agreement, and the situation in the EU and Eurozone. If you had one broad prediction, one broad forecast for the next 6 to 9 months, for the near term, could be domestic, could be international, could be economic, could be political, what would that forecast be?
Bloody hell. I think
on the spot.
Well, I think ultimately my sense is that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is going to have to come up with something in the autumn that matches what he did in March. Because I think the idea that you can simply turn off the furlough scheme and leave it to the market thereafter is for the birds. And if we want a serious, as V-shaped as possible recovery from the corona recession, the government has to act and act decisively. So watch this space come October, November for more decisive action from the Treasury.
Sounds like a good note on which to end. So Professor Menon, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely talking to you.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. And as always, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time.